filling in for Janine for this episode of Remotely. And I have Scott Hagedorn, CEO of Omnicom Media Group North America, here with me to discuss the pandemic and its impacts on his agency network as well as the industry at large. Hello.
Hi.
Good to have you here. Thank you. So what stage are we in now of the pandemic regarding clients? What are their concerns right now? Obviously, in the beginning, we heard that clients were pulling back spend. They were delaying payments. What are we seeing from clients now?
I wish that I could think of the pandemic in terms of some linear progression right now that has an endpoint. On any given day, I think we're probably somewhere on a spectrum between pessimism and optimism. Hopefully, with a bit of a dose of pragmatism. Q3 and Q4 for just from a sheer looking at kind of media activity, Q3 and Q4 are looking much better than Q2. I think. Kind of Q2 was a big dip as everybody realized. I think that this is a lot more real than we had been giving it credit for, and there was just an overall kind of freeze to the system. And Q3 and Q4 kind of people, clients, I'd say, are a little bit more optimistic on what activity is going to look like, and that varies a lot by vertical industry right now. And the ones that are being the most impacted are still kind of holding back, and then some clients are spending more because their vertical is doing better. But I think a lot of folks now are looking at next year and kind of trying to plan out what next year is going to look like, and to forecast out a bit of what the future is going to be and what it's going to hold. And that's where we are right now. So when I say pragmatic, we're trying to, as much as we can, get our finger on the pulse of how consumers are feeling, and is the demand going to be there? In some categories, is the supply going to be there? Which is something that we haven't really had to think about, as advertising and marketing sits somewhere between the demand and the supply, and trying to stimulate more demand or trying to point that demand at supply that exists.
Okay, yeah. What about new business? Now, a lot of the reviews that we saw when the pandemic first hit, they were either postponed or halted outright. How is new business? Are the reviews picking up again? We're starting to see new wins. Parts and Science had a big win this morning, RB. So
yeah. Hart's announced the RB win today, but we look at new business sort of into three buckets right now. The first is, as to your point, the delayed stuff. So a lot of the clients that were planning on a pitch sort of have put a pause on it for a period of time. There are new business activity like Reckitt Benckiser that had started before the pandemic hit, and then concluded during the pandemic, and we're in the process of transitioning that for Hart's. And similarly, we've just completed a global transition for PhD of the Diageo business, and that pitch process started before the pandemic became widespread, and converted though after that. And so we've been transitioning that business. And then there's been a ton of activity of pitches that have started, and the clients are seeing them throughout the pandemic, and it's challenging. It's hard to build relationships, I think, from a two-dimensional basis, and ultimately, as much as we talk about automation and being able to do everything remotely, the clients ultimately are they're buying teams, they're buying trust, and they're buying relationships. And we're kind of looking at, how do we best show that, prove that, demonstrate it when a lot of these clients have never, ever met us. And I think everybody's kind of operating at the same, kind of from the same perspective or point. A lot of the stuff that has started during the pandemic and concluded during the pandemic, it's almost, to use a US kind of sports phrase, it's sort of the tie goes to the runner. I'm seeing a lot of that business actually be retained by the incumbent agencies, because I think the fear of transitioning to a new team that you really haven't met and don't know is just too much to overcome.
Oh, that's interesting. A quick note to our audience, for those of you watching at home, if you have any questions or comments for Scott Hagedorn, CEO of Omnicom Media Group North America, feel free to leave them on our social channels, and we will try to get to them during this conversation. The next question I had for you is, how has it been transitioning to pitching business remotely? What has been some of kind of the biggest takeaways?
I think it started, everybody was shell shocked, and the technology support system was there to interconnect everybody, but the almost the energy and the kind of groupthink, whatever you want to call it, group consciousness that comes from working together with the team in the room. It was hard to get that going remotely. On some of the pitches that we've been doing lately, I feel a little bit of that vibe, and people are able to respectfully kind of build on each other's thinking without being able to see each other's body language and who's leaning in and who's leaning out. I'd say our teams have gotten more agile in terms of being nimble, being quick, kind of trying to look for more nonverbal than verbal cues remotely, but it's challenging. And then when you introduce like streaming and everybody's individualized internet connections into the mix, it can be really challenging to try to kind of get to groupthink. But we're going through it. I think, there's a cottage industry, I'd say, of WeChat plus Zoom that's popped up on how you can, be talking to your team while you're still presenting in real time. And it's kind of fascinating how the tech has infiltrated these discussions. But I think it's changed the nature of pitching. But again, I come back to the critical thing right now is how do you build trust, and how do you make sure that you're that the clients feel confident in the team that they're buying. And some of it, I know, maybe we're going to talk a little bit about what the future of work looks like, and what are we planning for. But I'm still a huge believer that the teams are going to have to get together functionally in a room and work. I mean, that's why people join agencies. It's a bit of the esprit de corps, I'd say, of being able to work with teams and elevate work. And also a reason clients buy agencies. They're not buying the individuals. They're buying how the team can work and what the team can do and deliver. And some aspects of that are still going to have to happen in person. So right now, even though everything is remote, some of the work we're doing, the remote and the tech-enabled side of it, is just a patch until we can start getting everybody back together again.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So what are the biggest impacts that you're seeing COVID has had on the media landscape, just in general?
I'd say, there's definitely, I think, more attention being paid to streaming. And streaming and addressable channels are getting now a little bit more of their due or fair shake. I think trying to look at now almost all media channels being streaming enabled and kind of identity-based currencies being important. And, so I think there's a lot of acceleration, I'd say, towards streaming and towards figuring out how to have a heavier mix in streaming, and also like looking at people are desperate for new content as something to do. And I think they're following as much as they can on streaming. There's some of the smarter folks on our team, especially in the investment side, like Johan Bosserup, who's our global head of investment. We're predicting a shortfall right now in the media space, potentially, of supply, since production has been shut down. Is there going to be a lack of supply for the amount of content demand that's out there? And again, kind of coming back to like thinking about supply and demand dynamics. And right now, people are super hungry. Like, I've never seen more review websites for Netflix content and Amazon Prime content, HBO Max content, Disney Plus content. Everybody's kind of looking for something new coming out that they can kind of divert their attention towards. And so we're tracking that. We're kind of rolling a lot more streaming and OTT into our upfront deals. And that, there's a big focus on that, I think. It'll be, the other interesting thing is kind of looking as some of the social injustice content and movements have been out there on how people are feeling about social media channels, and are they turning on or turning off to more social media, especially as the election cycle is starting to crank up in the US. And just kind of looking at what's happening there. And, are people avoiding the platforms because they're becoming too toxic, or are they a little bit addicted to the negative content and the hyperbolic content that are on social media platforms and feel like they have to be on Twitter and on Facebook and on Instagram more and more and more to get their fix? So that's, just speaking kind of to some media trends, those are some things that we're looking at.
Yeah, talking about the social injustice movement and, as we head into the election and everything, brand safety is always a big issue. I mean, how are you kind of guiding your clients through some of maybe their concerns, or what are their concerns there?
Yeah, we did an initiative that we called CASA, which was the Council on Accountable Social Advertising. And what we have tried to do from our position is, and this will rewind the tape a little bit, or I'll run the tape a little bit to some of the work we did as a holding company when the YouTube brand safety crisis hit. We followed the other holding companies initially and just, kind of were like outraged and outcry and one impression's too many. And then we sat back on it a little bit and said, unless we try to do something to help here, we're not really fixing any kind of the problem. We're not meeting anybody halfway. And so we started working towards, what a fix could look like, and working with Google on that. And this is a while ago, and it's similar to some of the other things we've dealt with viewability and fraud and stuff like that, which is like, we would rather take more of a product and policy oriented approach. And so with Facebook in particular, recently, what we wanted to do was work with their product and policy teams to try to build out a framework for testing, a framework for kind of understanding what's acceptable and not acceptable, and putting some controls relative to content adjacency, and looking at how we could then establish a framework. That the one we built actually has 4 pillars. It has pre-bid adjacency control. It has post-bid auditing capability, third-party verification of both that pre and post, and then some overall better reporting on what's happening on the platforms overall with content violations or flagging of potential content violations. And we thought it would be good to talk to Facebook about it, but also to talk to Twitter about it, to talk to Reddit about it, Snap, TikTok, and Pinterest, and Google. And we've gotten pretty much everyone aligned across the 4 pillars and are hoping to make some meaningful change. But our view has been that we're to some degrees a little bit like a hedge fund manager of media, where we need to try to provide clients with the best advice on mechanically how these platforms all work, and how what your ads are going to be potentially adjacent to, how do they work, how do you mitigate, if you have 100%, like if your view is very like 0 impressions being adjacent to anything that could be, potentially violate a content, like a policy violation, or some content that is wrong being adjacent to it is something that we can't tolerate. 1 impression's too many. We want to help clients understand, like, what are the trade-offs potentially of activating some of the different ways that inventory is activated, and how to prevent that. And so we're very much kind of trying to, make sure that mechanically we're counseling clients so that they know their risk, and they also know the potential reward. And because some of the risk comes against dimensions of cost when it comes to media, and that's how they're, they're weighting some of the decisions that they have to make.
Some shout outs to those of you who are watching. We got Nancy from Connecticut. Hello. Martin from South Carolina. Camelia from Bucharest. Naomi from Kenya. Stephen from Massachusetts. Sherry from New Jersey. Rohit from Vietnam. Marnie from Indiana. And Mo from India. Hello, everyone. Thanks for watching. We also have a question from someone in the audience. Alexis on Twitter asks, what is the outlook for hopeful interns and entry-level job seekers across the industry as we navigate this pandemic? In the beginning, these opportunities seem to diminish, but are they making a comeback? If not now, when should we anticipate on them doing so?
Yeah, I think that I would imagine that there'll be some internships opening back up in the fall. I can only speak for Omnicom, but I think that we'll have some stuff opening in the fall. The worst of the pandemic for this year was in Q2, so that was almost leading into the summer. So it definitely slowed down, I think, some of our programs there. And then I think we're opening. I know we're opening some up in the fall. Just kind of thinking about it against the school year. Relative to entry-level positions, that's a great question. One of the things that keeps me up at night is, we're onboarding, a couple pretty big clients right now, and some of the people that are joining the teams or joining an agency are joining for the first time remotely. And I get concerned. I know we didn't pre-plan for somebody joining our organization completely remotely and for understanding, what we're all about and what we think makes us different and what it's like to work as, knitted into the fabric of the teams. And we're trying to pivot how we work as much as we can to try to make sure that there's, some sense of inclusion and community, and that, that new team members get to feel a little bit of what we hope our special sauce or our differentiators to be in the market. And that's a challenging thing. And the other thing that I'm very thoughtful about right now is is thinking through, like, functionally why people are returning to the office. And when I say functionally, what functions do they come back into the office to physically do, and what can be done remotely? Thinking about new talent and functions. I'm also, when I say that, I'm also kind of thinking through what functions can we automate? Because I've got to believe that, or I know that for talent joining in an organization that might be coming in at an entry level, to find out, you're getting a job in marketing, but what you're really getting a job in is data processing and moving data from one Excel spreadsheet to another, or one legacy system to another, and trying to do that remotely while you're like, hey, I have some big strategy ideas here. I have some ideas on changing a client's business. And for us to say, no, we just want you to work remotely, and we just want you to move data from this Excel spreadsheet to this legacy system, has to be very, pull the wind out of your sails, and very disheartening. And so we're having a hard look at that. And we'll continue to do that, I think, hopefully after the pandemic, because I want to try to root out as much rote jobs and rote processing jobs as we can, so that for folks that are joining from an entry level perspective, they get to contribute from to their ideas and their thinking into their clients' business challenges.
Yeah, and there's also been obviously a big call for agencies to diversify their ranks. I mean, what is OMG's plans to improve? You can shed any light on the plans you guys have in place to improve diversity, equity, and inclusion for people of color in the industry.
Sure. In 2009, Omnicom hired our first, our chief diversity officer, Tiffany Warren, who's a good friend of mine. We just announced Open 2.0, which is an 8-pronged initiative. The first is we're expanding our what we call our open leadership across each one of the 5 families, if you will, within Omnicom. And so we have dedicated resources that are managing the programs and kind of managing our thinking and holding us accountable. So the first is, like, we're expanding our open leadership. The second is looking at how we're going to attract and retain more talent. And when I mentioned that entry-level position point in data processing, that actually came from our Black Leadership Network at Omnicom Media Group, because we were talking about what it's going to take to recruit in more talented folks from a diversity perspective. And they said, Scott, you got to understand that the entry-level jobs aren't as attractive as we need them to be. And it's not just about, increasing the numbers within our ranks, but also making sure that the positions that we're creating are attractive to the people that we want to recruit in. The other 2 are developing and retaining those talents that we bring in. The 5th one is making sure the clients are aware of what programs we have in place. The 6th one is giving back to the community. And that's one of the things that we were, in the wake of, what was happening with Black Lives Matter and all the social injustice stuff in the US. We wanted to do something very meaningful at the Omnicom Media Group level. Our plan was to try to help organize and rebuild communities, the communities that we have offices in that were the hardest hit by protests, and some of the damage that came from the riots that were associated with them. But we couldn't implement them because of COVID. We had to divert some of the funding and our thinking at the community level. But we did that in partnership with the Black Lives Matter, our BLN leadership internally. And then the other 2 are transparency and accountability. So we're reporting out a lot more data on how our teams are structured and how we're tracking towards our diversity, our DEI goals. And then also just, the final one is accountable, making sure that we're accountable, like John Wren is holding all of us accountable to driving these programs and working with Tiffany to make sure that we implement them. And I personally feel my higher order of accountability is to the team themselves and the talent themselves, to make sure they know that, you know, that this is something that we take very seriously, and that that ultimately I'm accountable to the teams, because it's ultimately the talent and the teams that deliver for the clients. The thing that we don't have hard coded in, that I'm also thinking about strategically, is then, you know, once we, you know, fulfill on this or keep working at fulfilling on a more diverse workforce, how does that diversity ultimately show up in the output and the work that we're doing for our clients? And so that's the other thing. It's like, you know, I want to make sure that the team is in place and they feel like they're doing really good, interesting work where they feel fulfilled, but also, like, how's that diversity manifest itself in the work that we do for our clients and our strategic thinking and thought leadership?
That makes sense. When you say John Wren, CEO of Omnicom Group, is holding everyone accountable, does that mean, or is it tied to compensation, or how is he holding you guys accountable?
Yeah, you know, I don't know if it's going to be tied to our compensation or not. But you know, we're a publicly held company. But you know, I think it'll be tied to whether or not we're employed, and whether or not, you know, when I say accountable, though, it's like, you know, it's something that we have to report out on, that it goes into our annual and, you know, kind of business plans that we then update and kind of provide a report on a monthly basis on how we're doing and how we're tracking and what are we hearing, and, you know, what are we hearing from the staff. And it's something that we ultimately talk about, and that we're thoughtful about. And you know, at the end of the day, I think, that level of accountability is not, you know, it's the comments are out there. There's no, you know, because of, I think, social media, and even social media applied to marketing and advertising spaces, people are talking, and the content is ultimately out there. And so, you know, if you're not fulfilling on, you know, your mission, and you're not fulfilling on the goals that have been provided to you and the things that you've committed to, you'll get called out on it more often than not.
Okay, we have another audience question. It's Matria on LinkedIn. She says, how have you built trust remotely?
Yeah, you can't really do a remote trust fall, or if you could, you know, it's going to be like a gym fail. Well, I mean, some of it is like, you have to figure out how to do, I think, an element almost of speed dating with clients from a new business perspective, to get to know the people that you're proposing for them. And there's a lot of desk work in terms of data mining, looking for connections. You know, who have the clients worked with before? When, you know, what's the tenure? What's the relationships? You know, a lot of times too, it's quickly learning, I think, and trying to ask us some smart questions of the clients on how do they like to work. You know, and looking almost like doing not a Myers-Briggs type analysis, but just understanding a little bit about, you know, how's the client, you know, how do they like to work? How do they like to work at the group level, at the individual level, and figuring out how to structure the right team around them. And I've had to almost go to school a little bit on organizational design thinking and how you can do that in a completely remote way. But some of it is almost like speed dating. So, you know, and getting them feeling like that they could trust this person, they could work with this person, that this person is, you know, if something else should go wrong in 2020, that this is somebody that they could text at 1 a.m, and at least by the next day at, you know, 8 a.m, 7 a.m, they'll have had a response.
Great. Are there any plans to open the offices, or how is that kind of looking?
Yeah, no, most of our offices are open. So we reopen them on a state-by-state basis with the guidance from the state. The guidance from the state, though, is challenging because it's typically like a percent of the staff are allowed to come back and be, you know, the conference rooms by and large aren't reopened. And then there's a percent of staff that are allowed to come back. And I think that is like, unfortunately, almost industrial era thinking in the US, like we can only, turn the plant on to have 25% output, or only 25% of the staff should come in. And you start thinking like, well, what is the 25% of my job that I would do in the office? And this is some of the work we're starting to do, is thinking through like, what is the deep work that functionally we need to be opening our offices back up to do, and how do you get the teams back together to do that deep work, and then what functions of their job can be done remotely or at home. And that, so the offices are reopened. We're not mandating that anybody has to go in. And then I'm a dad. I've got a 9-year-old and a 7-year-old, and the school situation for a lot of our employees is touch and go on a state by state basis, and we have to be extremely thoughtful and aware of that. And that's why, I'm, as you can tell, hopefully, or maybe it's taken up too much of the real estate of this discussion or this stream, I'm super focused on like, what are the tasks, what are the functions that people need to do in the office, so that when they commit their time to go in, the team gets something out of it, the clients get something out of it, and they get something out of it. And they're not going in just to check the box that they completed doing some task arbitrarily and that they had to do in the office.
I think we have time for one more question, so I'm going to take this from the audience. It's Rohit on LinkedIn. In your opinion, what OTT or social media platform will gain most popularity for market penetration in a post-COVID scenario, and why?
Ooh, that's a good one. As going kind of to my planning and anthropological roots, like I'm fascinated with how some of the social media platforms are getting quasi hijacked to within the political process, and it's interesting how audiences sort of follow that from a movement perspective. And so I've been checking that out. From an OTT perspective, content is ultimately king, and I think it's interesting to see like, who has, who produced what and who's got what at the ready, and are some of the platforms starting to become a DTC engine for studio releases, like major theatrical releases that are instead diverting into going DTC. And I've been sort of pleasantly surprised at some of the how nimble some of the studios have been at in the face of making somewhat of a big business decision to release something on a streaming platform, and what that could do to the other side of their business, but how they've been doing that. And I think ultimately the OTT platforms that are going to do the best are the ones that have the deepest and the best content. And that it's odd though, that the thing that I, just also as a student of the industry, the thing I feel like is a big miss is that none of the, with the exception of sort of Netflix, maybe, none of the OTT and streaming platforms talk very much about the user experience of what it's like to get to content within the platforms. And it's almost something that gets greatly glossed over. And to think that your thumb is on a screen for so many of those platforms, I'm surprised that the UX of how consumers or users get to the content and how they can find it, and how those engines work to find and surface really great content. They seem like they're a little bit archaic, like the recommendation engines almost got stuck in time. And there's not enough emphasis, with maybe the exception of like Spotify and some of the stuff they've done after they acquired Echo Nest. But that there's like something going on from a UX and recommendation engine that I'm waiting for the next big breakthrough. And I ultimately think that's going to be, as much as the content is important, the content somewhat becoming democratized across multiple platforms because everybody's got their deals in place for distribution. But I think that there is the one that could really win in all of this, and it could be social or OTT, is the one that really breaks through with something new and cool from a UX and recommendation perspective.
Well, we are unfortunately out of time, but thank you so much, Scott, for joining us, and thank you, audience, for watching and submitting your questions. This has been another episode of Remotely.